Well, my next guest is Menzies Research Centre Senior Fellow Nick Cater, who has first-hand experience of Kevin Rudd's diplomacy skills. Nick Cater was at the time the editor of the Weekend Australian newspaper, and he was at Kirribilli House on the night when Kevin Rudd allegedly left the door open while he was on a phone call with former US President George Bush. Nick joins me now. Nick, thank you so much for your time. So you were at Kirribilli House you were editor of the Weekend paper. Chris Mitchell was editor-in-chief of the Australian newspaper. You both went there to have dinner with the Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, and this all unfolded. Tell me what happened.
Well, it's not unusual to be invited around in those circumstances, and you know those conversations are off the record. I still think they were, you know, they're not to be. I'm not going to go into what he actually said, but we were there, and Kevin Rudd was talking about conversations with other world leaders, some of whom he was not very complimentary about. And then he said he had the phone call coming up with George Bush. He made a lot of that. I mean, this is important to Kevin Rudd for other people to think he's important. And I had to leave late in the evening, but Chris Mitchell stayed on just as he was about to make this call. And I assumed that he'd be going into his office, closing the door, having a private conversation. But no, he left the door open. He spoke on speakerphone. The details of that subsequently came out. But here's the thing. When the information came out about that phone call with President Bush, and Matthew Franklin wrote the story for The Australian, Matthew ran those quotes past Kevin Rudd's office. He knew that story was going in the paper. He virtually approved of it. So that, to me, just goes to underline the fact that despite the fact that he began his career as a diplomat, he's the most undiplomatic Prime Minister I think we've had for a long time. He just had no concept of what normal diplomatic practice was.
So that story by Matt Franklin, who was a journalist, he was the political editor of the Australian newspaper at the time, he said that in the call, Bush asked Rudd, what's the G20? There was later debate about whether or not that had been said. Chris Mitchell was there, overheard the call, but the only complete transcript was held by Kevin Rudd's office. As you said, they signed off on the quotes. They also chose the timing of the story a few weeks after that night in question. So this was Rudd deliberately, it would seem, or this is what the allegation is, leaking a conversation that he'd had with the leader of the free world, knowing that the story was going to embarrass George Bush.
Not only that, a quote that was designed to embarrass him by claiming that he didn't know what the G20 was. And I don't believe that's true. I can't believe, I wasn't there to hear it, but I cannot believe that George Bush would not have known what the G20 was. But you've got to put this in the context of the time. George Bush was coming to the end of his presidency. Kevin Rudd was a great fan of Barack Obama. He knew Barack Obama. And so we're in a position where our Prime Minister was really barracking for the other side and was out to discredit President George Bush in that way. It's entirely inappropriate. And put it in the current context, it's even more inappropriate, I think, that you've got Kevin Rudd, who's now put his feelings on the record in no uncertain terms about the man who could very well be the next President of the United States. I don't see how he can carry on in that position he has as our chief diplomat in Washington. His position is untenable, particularly after what former President Bush said the other day.
Trump said the other day. But that's what's so bizarre, why Albanese would have made this appointment. Like, surely that humiliation of George Bush would have shown that Rudd doesn't have the diplomatic skills required to be ambassador, not to mention all of the numerous comments, we've played more on the show tonight, about what he had said about Trump, even that he should be removed as president by Republicans.
Well, we'll reverse the situation. Imagine that the US ambassador to Australia had come out and said that, you know, Peter Dutton was unfit for office, that he was, he was an enemy of democracy. Albanese, either side.
Because Trump was the current president at the time. Rudd made a lot of these comments.
It is not his place to say it. It is the Australian people's place to make up their own mind about Peter Dutton and Albanese.
Yes.
We wouldn't. That would be something which we couldn't really countenance, and I'm sure America would do the right thing and withdraw their ambassador under those circumstances. Just as I think that. Well, the best thing is for Kevin Rudd to realise what he's done and to gracefully step down.
Well, Nick, loved having you on, and I miss the days when you were weekend Australian editor. In fact, you were one of my first editors at the Sunday Telegraph more than 20 years ago when I was a teenager. So
you were one of the best reporters we ever had, Shari.
Thank you, Nick.